I've been a higher education policy analyst for 41 years. I study who goes to college, who doesn't, and why from a public policy perspective. Most of my work focuses on populations that are underrepresented in higher education. If somebody would have asked me when I started my career in 1970, who are these populations? Nobody did, but if somebody would have, hypothetically, I would have said, well, clearly it's poor kids, black kids, and girls. Today, it would be a little bit more complex answer. It would say low-income first-generation kids, the underrepresented minorities of blacks, Hispanics, and American Indians, and boys. No great surprise there except for the one group that's made extraordinary progress has been girls. Girls surpass boys in high school graduation and college continuation rates in the late 70s, around 76 or 77. They surpassed males in college enrollment in 1981, and they surpassed males in bachelor's degree completion in 1991. And since 1981, we've graduated about 2 million more girls with bachelor's degrees than we have boys, which brings up a whole set of very interesting kinds of issues. Most of my work focuses on low-income kids. Partly that's why I was brought in to work for the State Scholarship Commission. You can also say that maybe I'm just a damn Scandinavian socialist from Minnesota, who in this political time and place is entirely a fish out of water. But the fact of the matter is, in every state, a growing share of K-12 students are on free and reduced price school lunch. In Illinois, in 1989, about 32% of K-12 students were approved for free or reduced price school lunch. Today, 2010, that's 52%. Over half of the young people coming up towards higher education are growing up in families that when they reach college age, they will have zero resources to pay for higher education. And on this campus, it costs about $23,000 a year to attend. So how are these low-income kids going to afford higher education when the costs keep going up, their family incomes in many cases are going down, and the financial resources provided by the federal government and the state have been largely flat for a very long time.
I'm curious what your take is on why America has lost the gumption for an educated population or some sort of investment along the lines of what it made with the GI Bill back in the day. Why have we not reinvested or seen that level of reinvestment in an educated workforce since then?
I wish I had the answer to that question. I lay awake at night thinking about it. I know when it happened. It happened in 1980. We had just had an unsuccessful presidency with Jimmy Carter, and the conservatives saw an opening and they elected Ronald Reagan. I don't think Ronald Reagan started this revolution. I think the seeds are a couple of years earlier. I remember from that period in the late 70s when we started to have a political discussion in this country about higher education being basically a private good and not a public good, and therefore people ought to pay for their own benefits from higher education, and the taxpayer shouldn't be supporting that. I think you could also say that that's an intergenerational cop-out. That is, the generations up to 1980 that had always sacrificed themselves for the next generation backed away from making that commitment to the generations that followed after 1980. That's when this country started borrowing from its future rather than investing in its future. And the consequences are really rather straightforward. They're predictable from social science research. The economists, the sociologists could have predicted what's happened, not with great mathematical precision, but the general trends were probably quite clear in 1980. And that's why I have a job, is to go out and document these consequences and sort of push them back into people's faces and say, is this what you wanted? Is this the kind of world we're leaving to our children, where we've borrowed fiscally from the future? We've spent beyond our means for the last 30 years. You can say the same thing about the environment, that we've borrowed from the future to live beyond our means irresponsibly today. I think these are sort of the nagging questions that, in my view, represent a failure of my generation to make the same kinds of commitments to investing in the future that my parents and my grandparents and generations that came before us have always done. In my view, it's been quite un-American. I'll lay it out tonight in terms of manufacturing, basically goods-producing industrial employment versus service industry employment. Goods-producing industrial employment after World War II was about 47–48% of the jobs in the economy. It's now down to much less than 20%, probably closer to 15%. These are jobs, you could do them any place in the world if the shipping costs were low enough, produce a good in some other part of the world and then ship it back to the United States. We've been growing jobs in service providing industries, education and healthcare, business and professional services, leisure and hospitality industries, information. We've been growing jobs in those industries, and those jobs require a lot of post-secondary education and training. So if you want to make it, you got to go where the jobs are, and where the jobs are require a lot of post-secondary education and training. And unless somebody knows, unless this world changes course, unless we go back to sort of a pre-World War II economy, the idea of well-paid jobs for unskilled workers is just, it's a fantasy. It's not there. We have people in society who try to make that happen. Nearly all of them, sooner or later, end up in prison. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. We used to be number 2 to Russia, and then Russia simply said, we can't afford this anymore. So they turned prisoners loose. It's not that they don't have a criminal element, it's just that they can't afford to house them. And we're still wealthy enough that we can afford to build and fill our prisons. In fact, that's where a part of the resources that used to go to higher education are going. And so dealing in investments in the future, we're trying to remedy the problems that our failure to make those investments have created. The greater cost shift has been out of education into healthcare. Our healthcare system is just wildly out of control. Medicare, Medicaid, congressional attempts to deal with it right now are, people are looking at the same numbers I am and say, at some point, 100% of the economy is going to go into healthcare. We're not going to have any food, we're not going to have any housing, we're not going to have any cars, no gasoline, no energy, nothing. But damn, we're going to have real fine healthcare. But and some people are trying to curb that. It's very unclear to me how we're going to do that, but the healthcare system is really operated without any sort of fiscal control or responsibility for many decades, and higher education is just one of several parts of social spending that have lost out as a result. For decades, I've said that public higher education is being privatized, and public higher education has to look to private higher education to see the models about sustainability, viability, how to continue providing valuable social services. If I were coming back, though, to this state in particular, and I say this having worked in Springfield on the monetary award program, the state's gem of a higher education program. Many years ago, Illinois has always been a national leader in need-based financial aid. The highest priority of the state has to be the monetary award program. I don't see how this state or any place else can continue to squander very limited, very scarce state resources, keeping tuitions low for wealthy students at the expense of adequate and appropriate financial aid for people who need it. I can't understand, I can understand from a political perspective why that trade-off is made. I can't understand it from an economic perspective. And this is one of these areas where I have to push people back into this reality that 52% of the K-12 population is on free and reduced price school lunch. And by definition, that means they will have zero resources to pay the $23,000 cost of attendance bill here at SIU Carbondale. In other kinds of forums, I would answer that question a little bit more generally. There is an outdated view of higher education that the purpose of higher education is to select the worthy. In other words, it is a classification function. We reinforce the class-based structure. That is, those who come into college best prepared are those most worthy of being college educated. These are, to a very high degree, the children who come from affluence, who come from families with college educated parents. They have the greatest social capital. They look most like the professors who want to teach students they are most comfortable with, that look sort of like them. But that's a greatly shrinking share of the population, and it certainly doesn't deal with this broader issue. So in the broadest sense, I say that higher education is currently, in a broad sense, a long-term sense, dividing and weakening the country. It is enriching the rich and impoverishing the poor, and growing income inequality, to which now higher education is a major contributor, has a long list of social pathologies associated with it. Higher education is moving in the direction of, especially four-year higher education, of limiting enrollment to basically kids who come from the most affluent families, enriching the rich and impoverishing the poor. I made a comment earlier today, and I was surprised that people sort of picked up on it very quickly. At the very beginning of my career, 40 years ago, there was a group called the Carnegie Commission on Higher Education. And the Carnegie Commission, in one of their reports, talked about this large cadre of educated, unemployed young males in the Middle East, and the destabilizing influence of this population on the harmony, prosperity, political stability of those countries. Well, you'd have to be dead and in a box and buried underground to not know that that time bomb has exploded in the world. And we are not immune from that. In this country in particular, one ought to be very, very sensitive. I think some of the early signs of this kind of response are evident in our extraordinary incarceration rate. In order to maintain social peace, we have to lock up a larger share of our population, and in particular a larger share of our young men, than any country on the planet. Any country. We're the world leader in incarceration. And another symptom of it is the Tea Party movement. There's enough unhappiness out there that at least some people are trying to work within the political system to change it. And I understand that. These are unhappy, unhealthy, unproductive, uncooperative times. And even though people may not see that exactly the same way I do, people understand we are not on a socially productive path. We're making decisions that don't seem to be addressing the country's needs or the country's future. And we are not immune to the kinds of pressures that have exploded in the rest of the world.